Well, President Cyril Ramaphosa will command the nation's attention when he speaks tonight in his State of the Nation address. You know the context to the speech. He leads a coalition government. There are major concerns about the provision of water in many places. The economy may be at an inflection point where it could start to grow, but violent crime has exploded since the pandemic. And of course, we have soldiers still in the eastern DRC, and US President Donald Trump is withholding aid from South Africa. His Secretary of State saying today he will not attend the G20 summit here. Professor Stephen Friedman is, as you know, a well-known political analyst. Professor Friedman, good morning to you, sir, and thank you for your time. Let's start with the domestic picture. First, the president leads a government including parties, including the ANC, the DA and others, still dominated by the ANC, I suppose. Is that going to sort of change the tone of what he does tonight, the fact that he's leading a coalition?
Well, that's the key question, Stephen. I mean, first of all, I must congratulate you on using the word coalition, because I think it's very important that we describe things as they are rather than as politicians would like us to spin them. So it is a coalition. And quite frankly, it's a coalition in which only three parties matter. The ANC and the DA matter because without them, the coalition doesn't have a majority. And the IFP matters because without it, the coalition doesn't control KwaZulu-Natal. Now, I think the most important thing to watch for in this address tonight is what do the coalition parties stand for and what have they agreed to? And the context to this is that all the disputes that we've seen between coalition partners have been about legislation which was introduced before the coalition existed. The Bella Act, National Health Insurance Expropriation Act, all of these were passed in the previous parliament. So they tell us what divides the parties, which we know already. What we don't know at this stage is what unites the parties. Because the only indication of that we have was the president's opening of parliament address last year, which, yes, it followed a Lekgotla, but really they hadn't had much time to talk to each other, so it was very vague generalities. To me, if what we get this evening is more vague generalities, then it tells us that the coalition partners haven't agreed on anything of substance. If we get some very concrete plans, then perhaps we can start to say, look, this coalition is beginning to find each other, is beginning to get a sense of what it's going to be doing over the next 4.5 years. Because right now we have no sense, as the South African public, what the coalition stands for and what it has in mind and what it's been able to agree on.
I mean, it seems to me sometimes the coalition is just a holding pattern because people like, I don't know, Helen Ziller and others are watching the fracturing of our politics and really just planning ahead. No one's really focusing on governance now. I mean, it shouldn't be like that, but it sometimes feels like that. The parties are almost looking for points of difference rather than points of similarity.
I think that's a fair point. I mean, one of the things that struck me about this coalition so far is that nobody has changed their behavior in the slightest. The parties are behaving as though we're still in a situation in which the ANC is the majority and the others are in opposition. Down to the fact that, I gather the DA had some problems about the military parade this evening in the light of what's happened in DRC, etc. And it's written a letter to the government. Well, it's in the government. It shouldn't have to write a letter to the government. It should raise it at cabinet meetings or at various other forums. So at the moment, the impression which is given is that they're sharing a government because they have to, because otherwise there would be no majority. But they really haven't got to the stage of working out how they're going to work with each other. Of course, the other point which is quite striking about this government is that, quite regularly we have ministers and deputy ministers of different parties disagreeing with each other in public on very basic issues. And this creates the impression that, what we're dealing with now is not a government, but a collection of ministries.
I mean, part of that we obviously see over the NHI, which I think may be a sort of red line issue for the DA because its supporters will not tolerate the banning of medical aids. And yet for the ANC, this is a fundamental issue for its supporters. So you've got two parties who both almost have a motive to keep this issue alive. There seems to be a deal over it now that medical aids would stay. I'd like to see the health minister himself sort of talk about that. Perhaps maybe he has already. But I mean, is this how we're going to see governance for a while? I mean, could tonight maybe mark a break from that and give us something substantive?
Well, let me say, first of all, I think the NHI is purely political theatre. And the reason I say that is that, yes, both sides say it's their red line. But on the other hand, Nicholas Crisp, who is the Deputy Director General of Health in charge of NHI, has said publicly that it took Japan 35 years to introduce the NHI, and he hopes we'll be able to match that achievement. So, why you would expect a government which is going to be in office for 5 years to tear itself apart over something which is going to take 35 years is not entirely clear. So what is happening with NHI is that the parties are quite clear, obviously aware that nothing's going to happen over the next 5 years, which is going to make terribly much difference to either of them. And they're therefore doing a lot of posturing. And the reason they're doing the posturing is that both of them have constituencies who are not entirely happy about the coalition. So because there are doubters on both sides of the fence, you make a huge hullabaloo in public about something is not going to be important over the next few years. But yes, this is not the optimal way of governing a country. And to me, the crunch issue, as you said, in tonight's State of the Nation address is, are we going to get a plan for going forward which is endorsed by the coalition parties? Because if we aren't, well, obviously what we're describing here is simply going to continue.
I mean, to an extent, the coalition is dominated by parties of, this is not a technical phrase, Prof, but of the broad middle. There should be lots they can agree on.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that if they actually got down to it, they'd find that there's a huge amount that they could agree on. The most obvious thing that they can agree on is fixing government. There's nobody in the coalition who thinks that's a bad idea. There are various economic initiatives they can take, which are consensus issues which are within the coalition. And yes, they represent different constituencies and they have different, something like the Bella Act draws that out. But you don't have to deal with those issues over the next few years. And in fact, I'm quite interested that they haven't used it yet. They haven't had the opportunity to use it. I've pointed out previously that they have an escape hatch if they ever want to use it. And that's the national dialogue. The national dialogue is supposed to start shortly. And the role that the national dialogue might play is if they really have issues going forward on which they can't agree, they can shunt those off to the national dialogue and say, well, we'd be guided by what they come up with. So, if they got into a room and thrashed this out, there's a great deal they could agree on. And I'm struck by basic issues which they cannot agree on in public. If you look at the spat in the communications ministry about the legislation on the SABC, you get the impression that, the minister and the deputy minister say that they work well, but they don't seem to discuss an issue as basic as whether the ministry feels that a piece of legislation should be passed or not. And one really wonders why it's not possible for them to sit down and iron these issues out. Because, no, this is not the kind of coalition which is doomed to come apart. It can survive the 5 years if they actually talk to each other.
The situation around US President Donald Trump, he's been making threats against our government over our Expropriation Act. Overnight, his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, saying he would not be coming to the G20 summit here next week because South Africa is doing, I love this phrase, very bad things. Also that the G20 would be promoting diversity, equality and inclusion policies, which are pretty much things our government stands for. I mean, how should we be dealing with the United States? Do we stand up and say we don't need you and then lose the money? Do we, bend over? How do we bend over backwards? What do we do?
Well, Stephen, on one level, there's nothing we can do. And I think in the sense of trying to change what they do. Because if you look at Rubio's statement, very interesting, and I predicted this because it started to come up in the Trump, it was a theme in the Trump first term. It's not only South Africa who they have a problem with, it's the G20 they have a problem with. They don't like alliances. They don't like partnership. It's why they pick fights with Canada and Denmark, and they're about to pick a fight with the European Union. Is because Trump and the people around him are what are called unilateralists, okay? They believe that America should run the world, and they believe that America should tell everybody what to do. And they don't want to sit in meetings with Europeans and North Americans, let alone with Africans. And, you're dealing with some very hardwired attitudes here. So, when people say we must try to get into their good books, that is not a viable strategy. What you have to do is keep the conversation going so that you can try to minimize the damage. Try to play the political game in the US, because that is at least something which might keep some of the resources flowing. But most importantly, I think that we have to come up with alternative strategies. Where else do we find allies, and do we find resources? And I think that might be a lot easier than some people think, because remember, he's not only alienating the usual suspects, he's alienating the European Union. So maybe there are discussions which South Africa needs to be having with the European Union. But I think generally the strategy has to be very polite to the US, as government has been doing, but to do some very strategic thinking about how we're going to not be dependent on the whims of people who quite clearly don't like